So like as freshmen, they're given an advantage because they realize internships exist earlier and they apply earlier. So I'm sort of going to be covering background knowledge on all this stuff. Like all the contextual knowledge I picked up over the past 3 years, like I went through a bunch of pain and a lot of stuff, but you guys will hopefully just get the fast track to learn all this knowledge. So this is sort of just like what I wish I knew when I was, I guess, like a freshman or a sophomore. Cool, so a quick roadmap for what we'll be covering today. So I'm gonna start with the timeline. Right? So the timeline is gonna be like approximately what months do you need to have different things ready to successfully like land an internship or a full-time job, all right? Next, I'm gonna cover some different things on resume. Okay, resumes, I think I've reviewed a couple resumes, and generally when I review underclassmen resumes, so heads up, I was a TA for this class last year, so I've reviewed like a lot of underclassmen resumes, and there's a lot of like the same mistakes I see. So chances are you have already submitted your resume to our like collection thingamajig, right? It's like Friday or something. So you may want to maybe revise some of the stuff based on what I say here and maybe resubmit, or not, up to you. If you don't want to, you can also like feel free, if you see me on campus, just like send me a link to your resume or something like that, just like messenger PM me and I can give you a review as well if you want something really detailed, up to you. But I'll sort of cover like what are like resume best practices. Next, I'll cover like application. So like what's the entirety of like a possible application cycle when you apply with the company. So like what are the different interviews you might run into and like how do you ace each individual one. I'll cover the behavioral interview, that'll be like a little bit. And then sort of the chunk of what I really want to talk about today is like the technical interview, okay? I think a lot of us, we may have like a decently easy time with like applying, landing interview, or maybe not, so I kind of want to cover that stuff. But like the toughest part by far is the technical interview, and that's going to be the meat of what I cover today. And then the last thing is like weighing factors, how do you choose what offer to take, and negotiation, which is full-time only. I probably won't cover those things today, maybe I'll do like a talk later in the course, but that's just sort of a heads up. Okay, cool. So, timeline. This timeline might look a little bit scary because it starts all the way in July, August, and ends with you signing your offer in September or October. Given there's going to be a lot of like, there's leeway, right? I've heard of kids getting offers from Amazon in like March, right? You're still interviewing in March, you grab your interview, you're offered then. It's possible. But by and large, the majority chunk of offers and your highest chance to land an offer is if you approximately follow this timeline. So it's still not too late, and if you haven't done these steps, then it's time to sort of like get on the grind and like do these steps within the next couple weeks, all right? So the first step is you apply, or actually, well, not apply, actually resume ready. So you want to have your resume completely ready, flushed out. You will probably end your internship or surf over the summer around like, you'll sort of know what you need to package to put it on your resume by, I want to say like late July or early August, right? You might not have fully completed it, but you know how to package it by the time we hit July or August. Okay, then you need to apply. So this is sort of contextual information that's useful to know, and you won't have known unless you actually go through this process. So I would sort of chunk companies into 3 general categories, right? First, you have quant firms, finance firms, we're talking like Jane Street, Citadel, DRW, Five Rings, things like that. If you want to apply for SWE jobs for those, they open like early August, okay? In some cases, like Goldman Sachs, I think opens July 1st, all right? So like, they're very, very early. They recruit super early. Okay, next is medium-sized firms. That's like Asana, Robinhood, Palantir, Stripe. These are going to open more around mid-August, and you can probably start interviewing around late August. And then finally, there's going to be Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and like Apple, and whatever other big cap tech, companies you guys care about. That stuff is going to open more towards like, I want to say late August, early September. You'll sort of interview during September. So usually all the companies sort of have open interview processes going by September. So that's like kind of the core month that you guys want to be grinding the majority of your interviews. So you end your internship around maybe September 3rd, 4th, 5th, or maybe September 10th in some cases. And so in the gap between you end your internship and you start Caltech, because look, like, let's be real, right? Caltech is really hard. So it is much better if you can just stack your interviews in your free time before you start Caltech, so you don't try to like deliver on both interviews and also performing well at Caltech at the same time. So then September, October, you sign your offer. So just like, that's a high level overview, that's sort of what the timeline looks like. Okay, resume. So I would say there are probably like 2 things that are important on this slide. So the first thing, so by far, the biggest mistake I see on resumes is like, I don't see many numbers. Like I don't see quantification into impact. Like, can I get a show of hands? Who has like anything about like ML models or like API latency on your resume? Anything about performance? Like, does machine learning appear anywhere on anybody's resume? Yeah? Okay. It's really important if you have like a machine learning model or like a project, like you need to be reporting accuracy on that sort of stuff. Like if I don't see any numbers attached to a machine learning, deep learning model, like that's not good. Because if I'm a recruiter, right, so like, okay, let's say I'm reviewing a resume, right? Either I'm a recruiter or I'm an engineer, right? If I'm a recruiter, I don't understand what you're talking about, like XGBoost, random forest, like that stuff doesn't really mean anything to me, and I'm hoping to see numbers and I don't really know what's going on. If I'm an engineer and I'm reviewing your resume, I think it's not a legit project because I don't see any quantifiable results, right? So it's really important that like whatever you have, quantify it to a number. So even if it's like kind of BS, you can still talk about like engineering hours saved, right? Maybe it's not like a performance thing you built, maybe it's more like like an infra tool, right, that like somebody can use inside the company. Like say like, okay, I have like X number of users, and if they use my tool, they'll save X hours a week. Okay, then report that like I save Y hours per year or something like that. So look, the calculations don't need to be rigorous, they can be very hand-wavy. But every single experience you have, if it's technical, it really, really should have numbers attached to it. That's like probably the single biggest mistake I see on resumes. And I guarantee you, once you start adding numbers to your resume, your like acceptance rates past the resume phase are gonna like drastically shoot up. That's something that I learned from personal experience, happened to all my friends. We eventually learned to put numbers on every single part of our resume. So that's like number one. Number two, I don't want to see anything that is like a description of a project. Every single bullet point you have attached to an experience should start with a verb. So it shouldn't be like, okay, so like here's the problem statement, colon, like we were analyzing blah, 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 blah. It should be like implemented this, led this, developed this, created this. Like every single bullet point you have for each experience always should start with a strong verb. So I've seen a lot of like utilized, used, programmed, worked with. Those are generally not verbs that you want to have. Instead, you should swap those out for like led, implemented, created, developed. Those are stronger verbs, like action verbs, I guess, that sort of help you really get past that initial phase. So those are probably like the two key things. And I guess like, does anyone have, I guess, who here like sort of brags on their resume? Like, do you ever package yourself a little bit better than you truly think you are? Anybody? No hand, that's not good. You really should. Like, your resume should be the best possible version of yourself that you don't even really believe is you. Like, it should be a little bit out of your reach because I guarantee you other kids are overselling themselves, okay? So it's important that you put your best possible foot forward. I know it's like sometimes really awkward to like say, oh, like I did this, I led this, even if you were sort of like, I don't know, managing 2 other people. It might sound awkward to say you led something, but it's really important to package yourself really well. That's something I've noticed with Caltech kids is like we have a tendency to undersell ourselves because we don't want to like build some great expectation and then like not make it, right? Like we feel a little bit self-conscious about that. But it's really important that like, look, this might just go through like an automated resume system, all right? So like it's really important to just put your best foot forward and like if you pass the resume phase, like deal with how you handle the interview later. But it's really important that you put your best possible foot forward, so never undersell yourself. All right, so then next part. So put yourself in a recruiter's shoes, all right? So your resume, it's like who here has color on their resume? For example, can I get a show of hands? Color? Okay, who's like black and white? Okay, so I would highly recommend adding at least a little bit of color. It doesn't need to be like weird graphics and like flashy colors, but just like a little bit of color helps a lot. Because if a resume, or if a recruiter so happens to be looking at your resume and it's just a stack of resumes, like color eases the eyes a lot. Because imagine they're doing like 1,000 resumes, okay? And maybe they're spending 15 seconds per resume and they're just like looking at it. If it's full black and white, that looks really unappetizing. They don't want to do it. But like, look, a recruiter doesn't have that much time, right? Like 1,000 resumes, 15 seconds per resume, somebody math, 250 minutes, like, okay, that's like 4 hours, right? If you do 1,000 resumes, 15 seconds per resume, it's 4 hours. So that's a lot of time. That's in a recruiter's entire morning and potentially a whole day. So you really only have 15 seconds to catch a technical recruiter's eye. So you should be using color, you should be packaging yourself really well. Okay, so this part is worth taking notes on. Everything I've said beforehand, notes, maybe, presentations up on, like whatever, maybe. But the point is, the next part, these 6 sections in order, this is worth writing down if you haven't already. So, okay, first off, importantly, I'm not just saying this. This is not something that I just created and I'm claiming is the holy grail. Like I've seen a lot of that when I see presentations. Like, I've actually gone to recruiters at Google, Facebook, Robinhood, and Asana, and they told me that this is the ordering of sections you should have in your resume. So first is education. Okay, like we go to Caltech, be proud of it. Caltech is a really, really good school. Technical recruiters know Caltech, okay? Like, we're famous. All right, we're a small school, but everyone loves Caltech. So literally the second thing a recruiter should look at your resume, they should see your name, that's number 1. And number 2, they should see Caltech. If it's BS in computer science, if it's like some other work experience you have at Facebook, like you're not doing the right thing. It should be Caltech. That should be the second thing a recruiter sees after your name. So if they look at your name, like naturally, your eyes are gonna go to like the top left. That's just like the natural state. So like Caltech should be bolded, like big font right there. Like you should really emphasize the fact that you go to Caltech. Okay, 2 is technical skills. So this is like, okay, like what tech have you worked with? C#, C++, Python, like Django, etc. So for a long time, I had technical skills at the bottom of my resume until like 3 recruiters in a row told me, look, like this is actually the second thing we look for. Like after we look at where you come from, like your education, we instantly look to see like what tech have you sort of mastered. Now, you don't need to know C++ to do a C++ role, but if you are doing something object-oriented, you should probably have, like if the role is object-oriented, you should probably have some version of like maybe C or Java, at least in a course, like on your resume. That's sort of like what recruiters are looking for. So technical skills go next. Okay, the 3rd and 4th sections are closely tied to each other. So there's experience and then there's projects. So these will fluctuate. Right now, most of you are sophomores, so your experience section is low, and your project section is probably pretty long. But eventually, you should phase your projects out as you get more experiences. But that's pretty self-explanatory. So like internships go under experiences, and like, did anyone take CS3? Anyone? Okay, you guys built like, is it still that like 2D physics engine stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, first off, I would highly recommend calling it 2D physics engine, okay? That sounds like mysterious and alluring to technical recruiters. But if instead you call it like game design, then they're like, oh, like whatever, man. But if you call it 2D physics, like this is literally still on my resume to date. Like it's one of the things that have survived. So please title it 2D physics engine. Like that sounds cool as, I won't curse, but like it sounds really cool. So experience projects and then finally leadership activities. So it's okay to keep some stuff from high school if it's like legit, right? So like if anyone did like debate or math or like USMO or any stuff like that, like high school leadership activity type stuff is okay to keep, and also college stuff, that's good as well. And then finally honors and awards. That's how you sort of quantify yourself against the benchmark for other people. Perfect, so let's speed around the application. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. I think, do people generally recognize these terms? Everyone kind of understands like this is the flow? I can sort of go over it, but this is like the longest possible process you would ever have. Generally, you'll get a subset of this process. You might have like a hacker rank, which is just like a general online coding challenge. You just do it like at your dorm room. You just like bash it out in about an hour. Maybe you go to a first round technical, you might skip straight to the on-site final round, and then maybe you have the offer. Like, it's possible you get a subset of this. But the point is you'll sort of have sprinkled across this behavioral interviews and technical interviews. So those are the only two types of interviews you will ever run into across this entire pipeline, okay? So briefly, I want to cover the behavioral interview. So for the behavioral interview, and again, top part of the slide worth taking notes on. Everything else is just sort of like, you can take notes on, just like things to know. So I would highly recommend having 6 experiences you can talk about off the top of your head. So look, like a recruiter prompt is not going to be exactly these, okay? They may not ask you like, what is an impactful project you've had? But like, there's a good chance they'll ask you like a sort of adjacent question, and you can tailor, like if you have these 6 things off the top of your head, they should, by the way, be distinct. Don't overlap them. You can tailor each of these like experiences to a question a recruiter will ask. Like I'm pretty sure I just have like this list of 6 things in my head, and I've never had to go outside of them when I get asked a question. So it's really worth it. And I guess I can sort of explain why. Like, does anyone really care why these are important? Like, do you want me to cover them? Or I can just like skip past. Anyone? You care? Okay, I guess the instructor cares, all right. Yeah, Captain. So, the first reason is technically complex project. Okay, so companies want to make sure that they're hiring a good engineer. All right, so you can be really good at leak code and really good at like, I don't know, like mock interviews and things like that, but be a really bad engineer. Like, it's completely possible. You could like overfit the curve and just be like, I'm gonna prep just for the test, right? So having a technically complex project that you've already done before is really important because it shows that you actually have the technical chops to get the job done. Okay, 2, conflict among a group. Like how do I put this? Tech companies are, in essence, just a bunch of small teams, okay? And if you hire someone who works really bad within a team, that can implode a team. And it's particularly bad for startups. Like one bad hire can completely screw over a startup's trajectory. And this is true for big companies too. A lot of teams at big companies function a little bit like a small startup, like a small team. So one bad hire can be really bad. So what they really care about is that you can handle conflict among a group and that like you don't get overly defensive if your idea is a challenge. Or maybe you can even help like facilitate discussion and dialogue to resolve a conflict in a group. This doesn't even need to be in a technical setting, but just any sort of conflict among a group. Like pull from your high school days, right? Like you guys all wrote college apps. I'm sure you guys have like a plethora of experiences that you put on those like college essays. Like go back to those. They can be really useful in the behavioral interview. Okay, 3rd is an impactful project. So if you have a project that's impactful, chances are that you as an engineer care about impact. Now, companies want engineers who care about impact because if you care about impact, you'll work extra hard for them because you want to see that your work is actually translating to real stuff done, okay? If a company hires a lazy engineer, like maybe they're good, but they won't really work that hard. What companies really want is people that will work hard for them. Like that's why tech offices are so cool because they want to incentivize you to stay beyond hours at the office. They want hardworking engineers, so if you have a project that's impactful and you talk about caring about impact, like that's a green flag for them, to you. Okay, next. So I guess like the next 3 are sort of like more iffy, like if you have them, it's great. If you don't have them, like maybe just think of another experience. But if you ever brought like unique insight that no one else thought of, that shows that you're creative and you actually add to a team, so you're not just sort of like the regular engineer that they could hire from Berkeley, right? Like you kind of have like a mind that is a little bit different. Like, you know, you are able to sort of think about extra stuff. Because there's a lot of great engineers that come out of Berkeley, right? Like Berkeley is a massive hiring hub. Like don't get me wrong, Berkeley is like an awesome school, great practical application. But like how you differentiate yourself is like, okay, great, like we go to Caltech, sometimes we can like, even though we aren't necessarily like taught all the practical stuff we need to know, sometimes our brain just generates ideas at a very fast rate. So if you have some unique insight, like really lean into that. Okay, next would be non-technical experience. So like it could be a sport, like look, companies hire humans, okay? It's not just engineers. They also want sort of like a decent workplace to attract more engineers and like fun people and all that stuff. So any sort of non-technical experience to show that you're not just like a code monkey or a code machine is really helpful. And then last is like anytime you taught someone something in a unique manner. When you become an engineer, it's really important to be able to translate your ideas and tell them to your team. Like that's how you get projects run. So if you're able to teach someone something in a very intuitive way, big green flag and really good, and a company will like really like you for that. Okay, so that's probably what I care about on that section. The next part is like know the company. I know this sounds kind of troll, but like I've had interviews where I would go in and I actually like I didn't know anything about the company, and the recruiter would start talking about like, oh, like John just last week like closed this round. I'm like, who the hell is John? And it turns out it's the CEO. So you gotta make sure you know who the CEO is, because sometimes people at the company will assume you've done your research, right? So they'll be like, okay, like John does this. So I'll be frantically like, luckily a lot of first rounds are virtual, so I'll just like frantically search up like Instabase John. I'm like, oh, like okay, that's like the CEO. So like know the sort of people going in, so you don't have to like stutter and not really know what's going on. 2, you should know what products they have. So you need to figure out. Sometimes they'll ask like, hey, like what do you even like about us, right? And you might talk about like the culture and the workplace, but you should also know a little bit about their mission, or like what do they even offer? Like what do they do, right? So like it's obvious you know Facebook, Google, Amazon, but like you might not know a smaller company you're working for, and it can be a big turnoff for them if you don't know anything about them. And then finally, like just know like why you want to work there. It's really important. They'll ask you that most likely. Okay, so finally the last part of the behavioral interview is having questions ready at the end. Who has like a set of questions that they always ask? Anybody? Like, okay, like can someone, what's the best question you ask?
I mean, I just asked what their tech stack is.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Don't be shy.
I ask about like work-life balance and stuff.
That's
it's
good.
more pressure to stay after and stuff.
That's good. Anyone else?
I usually just like ask about like, you know, like what are their like the best parts, like the internship, like either events wise or like structure.
Nice. And you? Or did you have your hand raised? Maybe not. No?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I ask, I guess it's one company, but I ask like what they have in terms of like events and stuff that help interns like explore like all the different departments of the company, if it's like a bigger one, or like help interns develop technically and non-technically.
Cool. Yeah, no, those are all good questions. I think that questions in general, they reflect that you've thought about the company, but there's also like a set of like, it's actually worth sitting down for like 30 minutes and thinking like, is there any like unique question that you can come up with that like maybe other people don't ask? So like, I'm not gonna give away my like whole like secret list of questions, so like, I don't really care about it, I'm done with it. But I'll just give you one. Like for example, I thought, and I was like, okay, like this would be a really cool question to ask. So I asked it at every single interview that I had, and everyone's like, oh my God, like I actually have to think about that one. So one of the questions I usually ask is, okay, when you look, so I'm talking about interview, okay? And I say, when you look around you, and however you define success, okay? When you look around your coworkers, whoever you think is most successful, whether that's you, like, oh, I'm Shivansh, I'm the greatest, or some coworker, right, around you who you think is successful. Like, what sort of personality, archetype, and background and interest does that person have that makes them uniquely able to succeed at Facebook or Amazon or insert company here, right? So exactly, oh my God, right? So the point is, if you can think of a really unique question, like that's not the only one. There's like a couple other ones that are like really thought-provoking. They can't just answer off the top of their head, right? Like the usual ones they'll get for days on end is like, what's culture, like all these other things, right? There are great questions to ask for your own personal information, but when you have questions ready at the end, it is not just about finding out about the company, it's also about sort of like getting you over the line in case you had an iffy interview, just to impress a little bit more, right? So for behavioral interviews, that works great. Same thing for technical interviews. You'll also get asked if you have questions at the end, and it's also worth taking the time to creatively come up with your own blend of questions, okay? And if you guys want to use the one I just said, go ahead and use it. It's like a really good one, and engineers for some reason really like it. So take the time, creatively think about like what a really good question might be that will be like blow them out of the water. Okay, my favorite part. So the actual meat of today will be like the technical interview, right? So first we'll go over quick structure, and then I also want to cover like what are sort of the tips and tricks I have to like ace it. And of course, like if you guys ever sign up for like interview slots with me, I'll give you a lot more feedback on like how do you really perform well in the technical interview. But this is just kind of like an overview. Okay, so first let's talk about the structure. So there's 3 parts. One really doesn't matter, and you should try to speed it up as fast as possible. Another one really matters, and that's where you should focus your time. And the last one is sort of what I've covered. It's asking questions at the end. It's kind of matters. It's not going to make or break your interview, but it can really help getting like a positive like light. One thing you guys might not know is I've heard of stories where your interview performance for full-time offers sometimes determines what salary package you get. So it is really important to interview strong, and sometimes asking those intelligent questions, if you've already passed the interview, can bump you from that tier 1 to that tier 2 category, or tier 2 to that tier 1 category, all right? So those questions, like really, really creatively think about those. I don't think I really see many engineers thinking about that stuff, and it can make the difference between like your comp can go up by about, including signing bonus, like 95K, something like that. So just something to know. All right, so the quick introduction. They'll always say like, hey, let's do a quick intro. My name is so-and-so. I've been on the delivery team for like X number of years, like machine learning, infra, I've done all this stuff. Okay, so they'll talk about like, 2 minutes. Or maybe like 1 minute. So jot down some notes, like namely, write their name, write how long they've been at the company, and like what team they're on, and generally what work, okay? So sort of have some notes, because you should probably know their name at the end of the interview, so just like jot that down. But when it comes to you, okay, so I can tell you when I was a sophomore, I was terrified of technical interviews, right? Like I sucked at them. So psychologically, here was my strat, okay? I was like, all right, well, we need to do a quick intro. So why don't I try to drag this intro as long as possible so that I'll actually have less time to do the technical question, so that if I don't finish it, then maybe the company will be like, well, I mean, he did talk for a while. So maybe, like, he's just gonna finish because he didn't have enough time. So like, we'll give him like an extra leeway. Like that never happens, okay? The only thing that matters is whether or not you finish the technical question, namely 2 technical questions. So when you give your intro, like it should be no more than 15 seconds. Your goal in the quick introduction is to, say whatever background you have, but get through it as fast as possible. Like don't delay it like me, because then you will like struggle with the rest of your interview. Okay, so that's the quick intro. We've already covered questions at the end, and then 2 technical problems. So that's sort of like what I'll be talking about for the next like 2 or 3 slides. Okay, let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing okay on time. Okay, cool. So the process to solve the technical problem. So this is not the tips and tricks. This is just a very rigid, like, what's the word? Rigid format you should follow, like when you interview. If you skip these steps, chances are you might get docked points. So just make sure, like there are a couple of these steps, which I see a lot of underclassmen, they just don't do. And they're really important to do. And honestly, sometimes I mess up on these steps, because like, this is just something I put together for the presentation after I thought a bit about it. But like, this is really like the format you should be doing. So number 1, select language. Who here, okay, does everyone use, who uses Python? Mostly, does anyone use not Python? Maybe not? Okay, so I would highly recommend using Python. So it might be that right now, you're more comfortable with Java, okay? So you might be like, okay, like Java, is it CS2 Java? I don't know, man, it's like, okay. So you might be like, okay, Java is like the way to go, like I've done all this stuff, I feel really comfortable with it. But I guarantee you, as you get better at software engineering interviews, like, how do I put this? So when you interview, it's about solving the problem, like algorithmically, and then once you've solved it algorithmically, you need to translate that algorithm into code. Okay, that's solving the algorithm. Once you have the algorithm solved, translating it to code, like your job is to get as fast as possible at this section, right? Because like, look, the first part of the interview is I will teach you how to not make it up to chance, but that's the hardest part of the interview. Like, how do I even do this, right? But what you can work on is moving really fast from aha, I have the answer, to aha, I have a functioning solution, right? And so Python is going to let you do that in as few characters as possible. So if you end up using Java, you have to do a lot of like instantiation, and there's just more characters you have to type. So even though you might be comfortable now, I would highly recommend switching to Python, because it will make your life way easier down the road. And if you keep going down like Java or C# or C++ or whatever you're using, like you might get really good at that, but I guarantee you someone who decided to use Python that's still in the same class is just going to be strictly better than you. Not because they're actually better than you, but just because they're using a more efficient language in terms of characters typed. So please use Python. Okay, now actually what do you do in the interview? So 1, read and understand the problem. Now this is not fluff. I really mean understand the problem. Like one time I was interviewing for, okay, I don't remember who it was, but I was interviewing, and I got a problem with this gigantic paragraph of text, and I was like, yeah. I was like, interviewer's yamming on, and by the way, please don't have that attitude. Don't be like, oh, the interviewer's like, please listen to the interviewer. I made a lot of mistakes when I was a sophomore. But I was like, okay, like whatever, like shut up, I know the answer. Obviously I didn't say this, but mentally that's what was going on. And then I go working on the problem, and I'm like, okay, this is actually kind of like tough. I'm doing these things. It's like, who has heard of like find the longest palindromic substring? Anybody? Yeah? That's what I thought the interviewer was. So I'm doing all these things, and the interviewer is acting all confused, and I'm not reading the interviewer body language. And I'm just like, yeah. So I get this thing, and there's a couple bugs, and the interviewer is super confused. And I'm like, wait, what? So I go back, I read the problem, and I just realized this whole paragraph, really all I had to do was verify the string was a palindrome. But like, I was just like, oh, as long as palindromic substring. So really read and understand the problem before you code. Okay, like really important. Can't stress it enough. Okay, number 2, I see this missed a lot. Who here actually asks clarification questions on edge cases? Like how something should behave? A little bit here. We can do an interactive exercise right now. So everyone know what a tree is? Binary tree? Okay, let's say I said I want you to code a function that will return the sum of all the leaves in a binary tree. Okay, who here would ask a clarification question on that question? Would anybody ask a clarification question? 3 people? What would you ask?
Like if it's empty, what do you do?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because, it's important to ask that clarification question in the beginning, right? Because look, in the real world, again, like interviews don't happen for no reason, right? Like interviews aren't a great, like you're not gonna get leak code questions in the real world. If you've ever wondered why we're given leak code questions to assess interviews, it's because of all these other intermediate steps that reflect real world engineering practices. So, for example, like, does anyone know what a ticket is? Like in real engineering, like if you get a ticket as a software engineer, you have to work on a ticket. Okay, pretty much what happens is when you work as an intern or an engineer, somebody will assign you a task. It's just a task. And when you have to work on this task, usually they will give you 1 sentence to work with. And it could be like, build the data ingestion pipeline to index like merchant data. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. So you have to go ask clarification questions on like what's the size of data we're working with, right? Like, where do I even start? Like, there's a bunch of clarification questions you need to ask in the real world, and that's sort of what they're assessing here. When you're given an ambiguous statement, like, find the sum of all leaves, do you think about edge cases, and do you ask how the program needs to run in those edge case situations? So it's really important. You should already be thinking about edge cases and asking clarification questions. Like, did everyone do their individual mock interview already this time around? I don't know. Okay, I don't want to spoil the question. Can I just like talk about it a bit? Or? Okay, never mind. I won't talk about it. Okay, perfect. Next, you want to give them the brute force algorithm. So usually, this is fairly intuitive. It's like, how would a really dumb machine solve the problem? Like, you don't need any data structures, any algorithms, any CS knowledge. It's just like, literally, how would like the most basic person go through this in the worst possible time complexity ever, right? So you do that, and most importantly, you analyze the space and time complexity. Does everyone sort of analyze space and time complexity as soon as they come up with a thing? You tell your interviewer? Okay, it's a really good habit to get used to. You should really be, every single time you have some algorithm, don't just start coding it, don't just start like saying, okay, or we could do this. Say like, this is what we could do, this is the time complexity, this is the space complexity, let's now think about other options and maybe we can do better. So that's the next step. Okay, now this is a sort of contentious point, but who here thinks better silent? Does anyone think better silent versus talking? Okay, so a lot of the time when I does anyone watch like Tech Lead or Joma Tech and things like that? YouTube, no? Yeah? Okay, so a lot of times people will tell you to like always think out loud because the interviewer just wants to hear your thought process. Like that's true. The interviewer wants to hear your thought process, but there's no reason that it has to be live. Like I think way better when I'm silent. So what I always do, like every single one of my interviews, I always say like, hey, I'm going to take 1 to 2 minutes to look at this question a bit. I need to digest it and I'm gonna figure out what to do. And then I will explain my entire thought process in about 1 to 2 minutes. You assure them that you're going to explain your thought process after, but I've never had, except at like Jane Street, like one time. I was like one time in all like how many interviews I've done. Everyone always agrees. So you just buy yourself some time to think in silence because I'm pretty sure we all code, like usually when we code, we're silent. We're not talking to somebody, we're not explaining our thought process. So it's okay to ask that question and like almost nobody ever rejects it. Okay, after that then think of different solutions and find the most optimal, which obviously is easier said than done, which I'll go over on the next slide. And then analyze space and time complexity, code it up, and most importantly, this is missed so many times, verbally test, like just test your function. Like as soon as the function is done and you've analyzed space and time complexity, ask your interviewer, awesome, this should work. I want to test edge cases and other cases to make sure my function works, but does this look good to you? So it's really important to say that you're going to test edge cases. They'll ask you to anyway, but it's brownie points if you do it first, right? You want to be driving the interview, which, by the way, is something else that I kind of want to stress a little bit, is it's really important when you're interviewing, you should be the one that is driving the interview process, right? So you don't want to sit back and wait for the interviewer to tell you what to do. As soon as you have the question, you have everything you need. You should be driving everything. It should be, here's the brute force algorithm, here's space and time, now I'm going to think more, give me 1 to 2 minutes, I'm going to go quiet, I'll explain everything, then unmute or whatever, and start telling them everything you've thought about, then say, cool, does this look good, can I code it up, then test edge case. Like you should be driving the whole process, okay? And it's a mistake if you aren't. If you're sort of sitting back and waiting for the interviewer to tell you what to do next, that's not great. Because like we already know what we need to do. It's just these steps. So just make sure you're doing this. Make sense, everybody? Nods? Yes? Perfect. Okay, so how do you ace the technical problem? So the first bullet point is like, it's trivial, it's not really that helpful. It's just get fast at implementing things, okay? So there's 3 ways to do this. One is, has anyone not heard of leak code? It's okay if you haven't. Leak code is like, it's just where I would straight go. Heavily worth buying leak code premium. I'm not like a sponsor for leak code or anything, but I would say it's worth it because if you're like prepping for a Facebook interview, like just go do the Facebook questions on leak code. Like it's worth it just to see what is the frequency that these questions are being asked at. So, leak code problems are really great. Mock interviews with us, that's one of the best ways you can get better. And then Google Kickstart and CodeGen. So these are things you can do from your like bedroom, and this is actually how I got good. Like a year and a half ago, I was really bad at technical interviews. Like I was probably worse than you guys were. Like I would just like choke up, panic. I was terrible at them. But then I started doing, because COVID hit, and I was like at home, nothing to do, and I was like, okay, cool. Well, like Google Kickstart and CodeJam exist. I can do them from my house. You should check them out. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these really help with getting fast at implementing things. Highly recommend. Okay, now for the actual like useful stuff that I think is like relatively non-intuitive or unintuitive. So can I get a show of hands? Like who here has a game plan at the start? Like when you are going to solve an interview problem, who has a game plan for how they can approach like every single interview regardless of the problem? Or like do people just generally sort of approach the problem, try to hash it out, hope you can figure out a solution, and if you can't, just sort of F up or give up? I don't know how many people go this. But okay, so it's really important to have a game plan that you can go back to. Otherwise you will panic. And so although you can have although there's an infinite number of technical interview questions that they can ask you, there are only 10 data structures you can use to solve those interview questions. So it's sort of like reduce the dimensionality of the problem, all right? Instead of thinking about, oh my God, like how can I prep for every possible interview question? Just start thinking and get really good about the process of thinking like, can I apply X data structure to this problem? If you can master that process, there's only 10 bridges you need to cross. It's like, it's on the next slide. It's like queue, heap, stack. You'll see it on the next slide. But start thinking about it like that. Like that should be your game plan. Maybe struggle with the problem, grapple with it for a minute and a half. Do whatever you guys do now. But if you ever get lost, just go back, reduce the dimensionality, and just say, okay, all I need to figure out is which of these data structures I can use to solve this problem. All right? And even if you like screw up on that, there's like another hack, which is the bottom bullet point, which is like super useful. Okay. The other thing is use your interviewer to see if you're on the right path. So like who here actively thinks about interviewer body language when you're interviewing? Does anybody? Good. Yeah, interviewer body language is one of like the most critical things you can look at. So anytime you finish a segment of anything, I don't care what it is. It could be you just finished coding, you just finished thinking up an algorithm, like literally anything. Ask them, hey, this is what I'm doing. Does this seem to be on the right path? Don't say, do you think? Say, does this seem to be on the right path? Okay? Use their body language. And if it's anything but, yes, that looks perfect to me, keep going on this path. If it's a slight stutter, if it's hesitation, like that means you are not on the right path. Because the interviewer knows the question. They know how to solve the question. Never argue with your interviewer, right? Like 100% of the time that ends badly. Okay, they know what they're doing because they know the problem. You've never seen this problem before. You don't know what you're doing. So if they are guiding you and giving you body language hints, like even if you're just like talking at them, like look at how their facial expression is, right? Like are they smiling? Are they nodding? Or are they sort of like if their eyebrows are like that's a no. Like don't do that. Stop. Like move on, figure out a different approach. Okay, so read their body language. It's really important. And I know we're engineers, so sometimes we suck at reading body language, but it's worth getting good at this skill because like that is how you can save yourself 10 minutes of wasted time going down a path that doesn't work. And now if you're really stuck. So in the past 2 years, I've been like really stuck on like 3 interviews where it's like, I just have no clue how to do this. Like I'm looking at the problem, I tried my data structure trick, like going through, I literally have no clue how to do it. Here's what you're gonna do, all right? Hack. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna throw out a random data structure. You're gonna start muttering to yourself, okay? Like they can hear you, all right? You're gonna be like, heap. Okay, not like that obviously, right? Like make it fluid, okay? Like a heap, right? Just a heap. Maybe a stack, but make it convincing. Okay, it's a performance, a bit of an actor. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna say, all right, you're gonna look at the interview. You're gonna say, I'm thinking about using a heap to solve this question. Does that seem to be on the right path? And 9 times out of 10, you're gonna get a hint without losing any like. The best way to put this like interview. You guys know what political capital is? Have you guys heard of that? Like a policymaker. If they want to pass a policy, they have to use some political capital because they're asking for favors. Maybe? Okay, I don't know. This analogy might make sense to some. I'm going to have some nods, some confused looks. So I guess if you understand this, it's pretty much like you have a set amount of interview capital. There's only a certain number of cards you can play, okay? If you say, I need a hint or I'm stuck, like, it's GG, all right? Like, you should not say that. That is your entire deck of hand, okay? And they will give you a hint, but like chances are, like likely I'm going to be real with you, you will probably fail the interview, okay? But instead, if you do this like muttering trick, like you use no cards and you get the hint. So really, the way I want you to think about this is if your back is against the wall, you have no clue what to do. It's all about baiting information out of your interview. Okay? Like you need to grab the information at as low like hand cost as possible. And the best way to do that, when you play the minimum number of like cards or hands or whatever, and get the most amount of information, is this: you mutter, you say I'm going to use this data structure. So it's not like I'm stuck, I'm lost. Really, you are stuck and lost, but you don't say that. You say I'm going to use a heap to solve this, but I'm not really sure. Does that seem like the right path? And they will either say, yeah, that actually seems like a good idea, keep thinking. And now you have a very useful hint. Heap is the data structure you need to use. Or they tell you, no, instead maybe, like your log complexity makes a lot of sense. Maybe look at a tree. So either way, like you've gotten a hint for free instead of saying I'm lost, I'm stuck. Instead, you just muttered, and now for free you got a lot of information. So like no, like I'm not capping. In all 3 interviews, like this worked. Right? Like I was stuck, and then I passed just because I baited information out of my interviewer. Right? So it's all about that. So if you're ever stuck back against the wall, data structures have failed you, you're panicking, just go back to this trick, and you will get some helpful information out of your interview. Make sense? Perfect. That's probably one of the most useful things I can teach you in this class. Okay, so what are the data structures to use? They're listed here, worth copying down if you want to take notes. Like, you will never encounter, I'll say like, I don't think I have a list here, but like a list is sort of like an int data structure. It's not really like actual data structure. So what I would say is like, you can look at this guide. I think maybe we'll post it on the course website. Time? Okay, I should probably hurry up. But yeah, so there's 10 data structures like queue, stack, dictionary, set, heap, graph, linked list, tree, BST, try. Has everyone heard of these before? CS2? Maybe? Okay, if you do not know what they are, you can go to that guide, and I have a lot of helpful tricks on how to manipulate these things. Like for example, does anybody know, is a heap implemented as a min heap or a max heap in Python?
It's a min heap.
It's a min heap, it's a min heap. So for example, right, if I want the k largest elements of something, like I will shove this into a min heap, right? And then every single time, because it's a min heap, it stores the min at the top, I'll pop the min out, right? So I can use a heap of size k to get the k like most frequent elements or k largest elements, right? Okay, now let's say I want the k minimum elements. Does anyone have an idea for what to do? This is an example of a trick I have there. Like, does anyone have an idea what to do?
It's like you make it negative.
That's right. Yeah, make it negative. Multiply your values negative going in, so that instead of storing the min, it'll still store the min, but it's actually the negative, which means it's actually the max. Then when you pop out, you just multiply -1 by the value. So like, there's a couple of tricks on working with, like, I'll have some confused looks, don't worry. Like, there's more detail in the guide. But the point is that there's a lot of like helpful tricks on how to interface with these different data structures in a very clean way. And like, trust me, not everyone knows that like -1 min max heap like trick, so you sound super smart when you do it. So that's probably my advice there. I don't really care too much about this slide. This is like pretty much, I think there's one more slide after this. It's just like weighing factors and negotiation. I'll probably talk a little bit more towards the end of the class as it becomes a little bit more relevant. Okay, here's a bonus. So here's other opportunities that people won't really know about. So number 1 is a VC fellowship program. So I only found out about this because I interned at Asana the summer after my sophomore year. And Asana happens to be a portfolio company of a venture capital firm. By the way, VC stands for venture capital. They're just a firm that gets money from other people and then like disperses money to startups. And then when those startups IPO, they get a return and then they give it back to the original people and take a healthy cut for themselves. Like there's a lot of like very prestigious venture capital firms, and having those names on your resume can really help when it comes to like just getting past the resume check. So VC fellowship programs are like hella worth. So 8VC, Kleiner Perkins, and Bessemer are 3 very popular venture capital firms that have fellowship programs, and you can do them. They're like literally no effort. You just show up to a couple meetings, like you network a bit, like it's like 1 hour a week or something, and you get the name on your resume, okay? So it's like super useful, but like networking, you learn a lot about that type of stuff, and then it makes you boost your resume. It's really great. And then of course, yeah, they really want Caltech people, so super worth. The other thing is tech fairs. So Caltech hosts like really good career fairs, but outside of it, there's tech fairs that are like hosted by other venture capital firms, namely Greylock and Contrary. Also apply for those. Applications usually open like, I think they run in July, so maybe applications open in like, I don't know, like May, and then it ends up running in July sometime in the summer, so just keep a lookout for that stuff. Then Jumpstart, now called Canvas, you can apply for jobs on that. My voice is tired. But that is everything. Hope it was very useful. And then now I think we have a live interview example sort of demonstrating some of the stuff I talked about, but appreciate it. Okay, perfect.